Come on in, sit down. Chair's a chair. It's for sitting and chilling. Book is really a book, unless you're reading it. Mountains and mountains, and a river flowing down from it. When I see it, I don't see it. Hi, tell me, what is it? There's something inside you, it sounds so familiar. May I remind you, what is it? Come on and tell me, go on, remind me. What is it? Afraid I'm not hearing it. What is it? Afraid I'm not hearing it. Little like you, about to chat and sitting and fights for chilling. Yeah, found myself sleeping in it. Mountains and mountains, and a river flowing down from it. Yeah, when I see it, I don't see it. Hi, yeah, tell me alright. What is it? When I see it, I don't see it. Hi. What is it?
Hello. Welcome to Place of Assembly. This is the podcast where we look at physical spaces that house creative communities, and we think about the role of physical space in the production of culture, what physical spaces mean to creative communities of practice, especially at this time when, for the most part, many of us are denied entry to the physical spaces we are used to going to. This week on Place of Assembly, we have Ben Ratliff, legendary journalist, author, educator, wrote for the New York Times for 20 years, and the author of 4 books, including but not limited to Every Song Ever and John Coltrane. The Evolution of a Sound. Is that right, Ben?
Story of a Sound.
The Story of a Sound. Thank you. Ben is currently teaching a course at the Gallatin program at NYU that traces culture in downtown Manhattan from 1850 to the present, roughly, I believe. He can clarify that. And also with us today as our remote co-host, the indefatigable Patrick Higgins is in the building. And, there he is. So we're going to have a little conversation about space, what it means. My practice is creative director of Hollow, Ben over at NYU, Patrick running Future Past studio in the church. Let me get into Pat a little bit. Pat is a incredible musician, plays in Z's, collabs with Nico Jar, film composer, and runs a recording studio up in a big, beautiful, majestic church in Hudson, New York. He can get into the details of that as well. So this is who is in the building tonight, this is in fact who is not in the building tonight, but this is who we're talking to. I'm going to spark this thing off with a quote from Ben's book, Every Song Ever, and then we're going to whack it up and take it from there. Just give me one moment to pull this guy up. How are you guys doing?
Really well. Thank you.
Yeah, really well as well.
Very good, very good. Okay, here we go. So, Ben, I chose this quote because you're talking about some things in your book with regards to the extreme kind of availability of music. Read the internet. There's so much out there. It's overwhelming. And some of what you said here relates for me to how I think about space operation, curation, or the lack of curation, and what audience members and artists and presenters may encounter when they come into a space. There's kind of some parallels there to the superhighway of the internet as it mediates music consumption. So let's check this out. Here we go. Every song ever, Ben Ratliff. We have a new assumption that music is ours to take just as soon as it is ready to be sold to us. We might get our cues about what to listen to from our Facebook feed or from sources that use music as almost neutral content in a mediated environment. Talent shows, talk radio, football game ad spots. Background music services have been vastly improved thanks to the information yielded by our online listening activity. Pandora's so-called genome recommendation model reminds us that there is more to be heard within a similar style based on that style's small or large characteristics. Other sophisticated music data algorithms, such as those created for Spotify and other clients by music data companies like the Echo Nest, profile your taste in music as a condition related to who you are in general, where you live, how old you are, how you are likely to vote. With these advances, we can essentially be fed our favorite meal repeatedly. We develop a relationship of trust with what, whom, a team of programmers, our own tastes, whatever that means, translated into a data profile. This all sounds very bad. It probably is very bad. Infinite access, unused or misused, can lead to an atrophy of the desire to seek out new songs ourselves, and a hardening of taste such that all you want to do is confirm what you already know. But there is possibly something very good, too, about the constant broadcast and the powers of the shuffle and recommendation effects. There is a possibility that hearing so much music without specifically asking for it develops in the listener a fresh kind of oral perception, an ability to size up a song and contextualize it in a new or personal way, rather than immediately rejecting it based on an external idea of genre or style. It's what happens in the moment of contextualization that matters, what you can connect it to, how you make it relate to what you know. So, I chose that quote because a lot of what you say about the sort of collision, the possible collision of musical styles and kind of getting outside of genre and being confronted by the unknown. And also, you kind of allude to a possible losing of a vocabulary for that experience that this kind of inundation of musical content could lead to. And these are things that I think a lot about with regards to the organization of space and of events and which events can and should happen on the same night, kind of leading to who might be in the building together. And then what I find really interesting about what you do here and what I kind of want to ask you to kind of tee this thing off is you really put a positive spin on it. Like, I mean, you acknowledge that it could be bad, and you say it probably is bad, but you pull something really optimistic out of that. Because, what you're alluding to is, basically like an iteration of surveillance capitalism, and anyone can go a very long way down a very grim path when we start thinking about these kinds of things, Cambridge Analytica and so forth. But you take a different turn and kind of choose a fresh alternative and talk about the possible benefits of the situation one finds re the internet as far as consuming music is concerned. So I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and also just kind of since writing the book and thinking so deeply about these things, to whatever extent you can evaluate this, how do you think it's going as far as people developing as listeners and kind of taking your challenge and developing those skills and relating to the content as this exciting, vast array of stuff, rather than something that is either overwhelming or just alienating because it's not what they already expect. The floor is yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it was about 5 or 6 years ago that I probably wrote that passage that you read, and I'm aware that probably a lot has changed, at least in subtle ways since then. And some of my own thinking has changed. Let's see. So the way I would begin is to say that the word overwhelmed came up twice or three times in the last, 3 minutes. And it has become almost a commercial word, almost an industrial word in, how people talk about the the great array of what is available to us and how we reach it. I do stand against the word overwhelmed, only because I think that the tech giants and the streaming services want us to feel overwhelmed. And in a sense, they are selling to us the feeling of being overwhelmed, precisely so that they can fix it for us forever, and we'll be forever in their debt. And oh, somebody realized how overwhelmed I was. Now I really owe them a lifetime subscription, and I owe them I owe them the keys to my taste. I owe them the stewardship of my musical imagination. So I think that I don't like to talk about being overwhelmed. I prefer to think that it's exciting. We have this opportunity that we're given, if we choose, we have access to an enormous amount of music. I guess we're talking about music. We're just talking about music right now. Yeah. I choose to think of it as an exciting possibility that comes with a price. And the price is that you will be sized up as a data set, as belonging to a data set. If you're not careful, Amazon, Spotify, whatever, will start to, in little ways, possibly at first, but maybe in bigger ways later, begin to take control of your taste, tell you that they know you better than you know yourself, and essentially you entirely by who you were yesterday, as opposed to who you will be tomorrow, which they can never know. So I hate the bargain, that I hate the price. I like the price less and less, but I'm still excited by the possibility of all that I can access. And I'm in a weird, fucked up way, I'm thankful for it all the time.
Right. Yeah, that's oh man, I'm getting this echo all of a sudden. Give me 1 second. Hold on. Okay, it's gone. Interesting. That's it's interesting, that critique of being overwhelmed and this quality that we experience all the time, where and this relates to the idea of curation, where everything is curated. Soap is curated, and incense is curated, and there's like a company that chooses the best stuff and sends it to your door, and it sort of begins with things like Pandora, but now it moves out to prepackaged meals and wine clubs that you join over the mail, and it's like it does sort of bank on this idea that you feel overwhelmed, and then try to sell an experience that is not overwhelming, but that is often underwhelming to you as this sort of salvation. That's really interesting, and that resonates with me a lot in terms of the operation of the space. How I guess this would be my follow-up is like, how would you feel that this quality of this exciting opportunity, which I also think as New Yorkers, we kind of have this sort of real world analog for that kind of automatically, because you can go to Queens and be around people from hundreds of nations and hear music from all over the place just by walking down the street, you know, which is absolutely not true of every place, as we know.
Right.
But writ large, not just for New Yorkers or people living in urban centers where that is the case, how does this quality of having all of these things kind of blasted at you all the time, and then having these people swooping in to sort of save you from that experience by presenting something that's kind of dialed into your taste, how is that affecting people's like IRL habits, you know, whether it's consumption of music or just how they move around in the world in either of your estimation?
Pat, you got any ideas about that?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, I think that I guess it's an interesting question to the extent that it's also nothing new to streaming. You know? So to the extent that we're talking about that issue, which in a funny way is a kind of question of access. So you have even in the pre-streaming era, you got a kind of relationship to, let's say, like your local record store, where maybe like a newsletter curating recommended new releases from like Amoeba Records in Berkeley or Reckless Records or Downtown Music Gallery is going to give you a very particular kind of pathway through the jumble of confusing things. Or even when you're a kid trying to get into left-wing or experimental or underground or new weird music, you don't have any idea how to separate the weeds from the thorns from the roses. And similarly, even in a kind of a pre-streaming era, the kind of commercial domination of advertising and its manifestations through like radio and physical space would have been probably in a funny way really similar. I guess that you would have still been probably confronted to a very real degree then with the same kind of question of what gets pumped out to audiences that aren't already seeking a new experience explicitly or aren't in a position to stumble across it. So I guess in my sense, the kind of typical usership for, at least at a mass scale, at a critical mass scale for things like Apple Music and Spotify are more, not to be demeaning, but as it were almost passive listeners. And so there's a kind of an openness to the extent that they are ready to consume, but to receive what's being told to be consumed, you know? So I wonder too, like, has that just sort of changed its location somewhat? Like, in other words, it's become so atomized that it's now like the delivery mechanism of a Sam Goody is almost now just in everybody's pocket. It's in everybody's cell phone.
Yes, right. And also, there were comfort zones before, and now there are 1,000 times more comfort zones than there were. There are, you know, because of the proliferation of what's available, and because of social media, which enables groups of like-minded people to form around an interest. There's many comfort zones. There's many groups of people who are essentially perhaps only listening to one thing over and over. I mean, and that's, who cares? That's fine. You know, people are into what they're into and they're passionate about it and they build their lives around it. And that's often how culture works. I think in terms of, Sam, you were talking about curating, another word that I tried never to use. Just, I don't know why but it irritates me so much.
Oh yeah,
but
yeah, I feel you.
When I go to your club, Sam, and there's like a big, perhaps confusing array of things that are happening in one night, and I have a sense that it has been curated by a person named Sam Hilmer, who I know to be the proprietor of the club, that's very different from having a menu prepared for me by, say, Spotify.
For sure, and that ties into Pat when you were talking. I'm really happy that you brought up the model of the record store, because in a sense, the record store and our relationship to these, legendary record stores that many towns, even the small towns, this is not something that's unique to New York, which we know from touring. In most places, certainly through the aughts, there was some person that was keeping this kind of visionary deep cut record store going in Akron, Ohio, and there was a little hole in the wall where you could go get into the deep cuts. And this was definitely, I do think that this kind of performed for me the function that some facet of the internet is performing for young people today. In that I was growing up in DC, and in nearby where there were two record stores that I was kind of drawn to. There was Vinyl Inc. and Phantasmagoria, and I want to highlight what I think is a very different quality in that mechanism, the social mechanism of the record store as a kind of portal to a greater musical awareness, which is that you're going along in your life and you're just some little kid, you're just being a kid. Right. And then somewhere along the line, you're kind of contacted by some kind of music, right? It could be metal, it could be hip hop, it could be something, right? It's not important what it is, really. And then you figure out that you can explore this thing at a given record store. And you go into that record store, and in our case, I think I speak for both of us, Pat, and Ben, I'm pretty sure I speak for you too. It was punk and hardcore and things like this, right? Yep. And these record stores were clerked by guys and gals in bands. You know what I mean? And as a 13 or 14-year-old person, to get up the nerve to talk to these people about music is like terrifying. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
You gotta like. You
absolutely.
Because you're like, for me it would have been like the era of like Nirvana roughly speaking, and maybe I had kind of figured out who the Pixies were, and I was kind of just getting into it, and you're trying to establish a rapport with this person, and they're playing this music in the store that you've never heard, and you're like, man, what is this? Who is this person? Like, maybe this is kind of where I'm headed. Can I learn from them? And they're maybe 23 and you're 14, and then one day you pick something out and they're like, oh, great record, and you're like, holy smokes, man, they noticed, you know what I mean? And then right. you start maybe right. If you can build that relationship, you start talking to them, and then it turns out they're like, oh, well, what you really need to check out is Albert Eiler. And then you're like 15 by this point, and you go listen to Albert Eiler, and you're like, holy smokes, I hate this, but I got to figure out why this is amazing, or you just love it immediately, or whatever, But it's this actually like terrifying and kind of painful social experience that opens you up in this radical way to things that you like totally weren't expecting, and in that way, in certain ways it does perform the same function, and in other ways it's very, very different. And I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts about, the strengths of either modality.
I think in a way they're so different. I think what Ben articulates very poignantly in that excerpt that you had read was the instantaneous availability of everything ever issued on media now, which is actually kind of wondrous. I mean, it's actually astounding. But by kind of contraposition, the experience of stumbling across a place that has an entirely limited selection, even to the extent that sometimes something you're looking for, whether you want it or not, isn't even there. What you're encountering instead is a kind of an aura, a kind of a scene, a social scene that's grounded in a very particular space in which the people selling the records, talking about the records, stocking the stock at the store, and so on, are actually participating in something that is uh, a real avenue in the world, as opposed to like one that is merely consumerist, which isn't, of course, to say that the other one is merely consumerist, but at least in a kind of a structural level, there's what the two partake of in the most fundamental way. One is to receive a tidbit from a stream. The other is to enter into somebody else's space, right? Somebody else's store, to kind of give yourself over to that particular moment, which might be intimidating, might be exciting, might not even be able to give you the fucking thing you want, and maybe gives you something else. And that, to me, at least in that simple way, they are importantly different, but not even necessarily hierarchically, right? I mean, it's just really interesting.
I wonder if there's a word for the sense of revulsion one feels when one is catered to too precisely on the internet, or maybe actually it's the feeling of not an absolute bullseye, but just a millimeter to the side of the bullseye, where you feel revulsion,
Yeah, it's almost a kind of an unheimlich moment. It's almost an uncanny thing, right? Where it's just off from being accurate that it becomes grotesque.
And that's the feeling that I feel a lot in terms of things that are recommended to me on the internet. I'm impressed by the aim of the shooter, whoever the hell it is. It's not a who, but it's also wrong, and I'm revolted by it because it's entirely based on who I was yesterday and my buying and searching patterns from the last measurable unit of capitalist time. So back to when you're talking about record stores, I think of an experience. I grew up in Rockland County, outside of New York City. So it took me an hour and a half or whatever on a bus as a young person to get into the city. And it was always the city of my dreams. Kind of still is, actually, even though I live here. And so I remember one experience I had. I think I'd just seen Sonic Youth for the first time.
What year is this?
Well, it might have been like 82. And I had the experience of, wow, I don't really have any vocabulary for this music. It's not really very much like anything else I've heard before. And I was really impressed, or I was really haunted by it, because there was so much I didn't know and wanted to know about it. So I think I remember maybe later that day, probably later that day, it might have been a matinee show at CBGB or something, or maybe I stayed at a friend's house and went the next morning to a record store in the East Village, which might have been just off of 8th Street on either 1st Avenue or 2nd Avenue. The store didn't stay there very long, but it seemed to me to be ground zero for the little area where punk was sliding into noise. Rat R and UT and early Sonic Youth, and I don't know,
like
all that noise.
Like DNA and Lydia Lunch and like all of this?
Probably, and Swans, Swans. Okay, so I went into the store and I bought a copy of Kill Your Idols, and as I was looking, and clearly it was a store that was defined by a very specific taste, and it was really small. And as I was looking around and trying to learn more about this specific aesthetic, I remember a woman came in, and she was probably in her 30s, and she seemed really cool. And she asked the clerk if he had the new Luther Vandross record. And he very kindly said, no, actually, we don't. We don't stock that. You can probably get that at some other store. But it was the way that she said, do you have this Luther Vandross record? I really would love to buy it. And it was clearly like, fish out of, like, you were in the wrong place for this. But it stuck in my head. And as I was looking for these noise records or whatever, I was thinking, Luther Vandross, who is that? Who is that? I'm going to have to find out who that is. And it led me on a search, which continues to this day in my love for Luther Vandross. And so, like, in that scenario, Luther Vandross for me is code for what you don't yet know and what is worth moving toward. You may think you know a lot, or you may be satisfied or whatever, but there's this thing that you don't know about. And it might be worth checking out. And that's that's the kind of thrill I look for, or it's even best if I'm not looking for it, if it's just dumb luck, if it just happens to me. That's what.
Well, I guess this to me is really fascinating in the context of what we're kind of faced with now, this kind of terrain of utter availability and algorithmized automated suggestions, all this sort of shit. It's like what you're describing is like beautiful and relatable to the extent that it's also a kind of experience of simply entering into the world, which is to say, to like participate in conversation, to participate in that which has nothing to do with you.
Yes.
Right? Like encountering the woman who comes in, who gets you on another pathway or maybe puts you off on another day, or encountering the clerk who's maybe helpful or is maybe a dick or is maybe fascinating or is maybe inspiring or maybe isn't. So it's like, to what extent do we think then that the kind of platforms we're dealing with now even offer a kind of opening unto the world in the way that those do, however small? I think now there's almost a kind of closure. It's almost this dialectical horror inversion where you have the widest spread availability and yet this total tightening of potential experience, maybe.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I miss happenstance and risk, and the models I think of all the time, or the metaphors, are the record store and the giant library, and neither of those are particularly incentivized to like really burrow into your brain and figure out what you want and sell directly to your, you know what I mean? They're both a little aloof. They're a little aloof, and you have to, it's on you to find your way within them. And that's what I find I love. So if I can treat the internet like a giant library that doesn't care who I am, I'm happy. But I know that is that's a fantasy.
The internet cares very deeply about who you are.
Yes. Yes.
But I something that so kind of bringing this back to the idea of has there been an effect on physical space, physical lived space in the world as a function of, intentionally or unwittingly participating in these kind of portals that deliver culture to us, right? Has there been an effect on us as social beings? Because I don't think that's really thought of a lot. I think we think a lot about how the internet is getting crazier and crazier, and it's crazy how it can be accurate. And you say, man, I'd like a blue Monster Energy drink, and then you look at your phone and there's an ad for Monster Energy drinks in your phone, and that gives us this kind of creepy feeling like we are really being surveilled and it's like working. But are we actually behaving differently? Do you know what I mean? And I will say that in the venue game, something that I notice, I've run and or been a part of the leadership of 3 venues, all roughly in the same area, for whatever reason. And I feel that the appetite or just the regarding of heterogeneity as a positive quality in a lived social space has diminished palpably since I opened Trans Pecos. So the first venue I opened was Trans Pecos in 2013, and I think my mission has been the same the whole time. You know, no holds barred. We work with everybody, and you know, as long as you're safe and respectful. But we're looking at musical content, and we're not trying to message about some specific take on social life. You know, it's about substance. You know what I mean? We'll work with any legitimate community that's really, and you know, not even manifesting the substance necessarily, but authentically in pursuit of it. You know what I mean? That can behave safely in a space, okay? And I felt like this message really landed in 2013 and 14. And increasingly, I feel that it's something that needs to be kind of defended. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not, I don't want to take it too far. It's not like people are super freaked out by it or something, but it's not seen as a value add most of the time when you have a space and 3 or 4 things are going to happen that night, and maybe people have a kind of specific aesthetic social experience that they're going to imagine that they're going to have, and come to find out that some other people are pulling up at 9, and that's going to kind of dovetail, and they're not really part of your vision for what you were imagining. That there's, and it increasingly that's seen as a drawback. And conversely, what I also notice is that it is more and more common that venues are orbited around delivering a very specific kind of music, you know, style, and not just that, but aesthetic, social, lifestyle experience, and not deviating from that, right? I feel like in the 90s, dominantly like venues, let's not say clubs, but venues, were kind of multi-purpose. You know, the Knitting Factory, Brownies, the Mercury Lounge, the Cooler. It was a space with gear and staff wherein events could happen. Certainly they had aesthetic, stylistic predilections, but they were various. You know what I mean? And that's kind of just how venues were. You know what I mean? And now venues that are not niche-based are the outliers, for sure. And I can't help but feel that what we're doing here isn't just like the internet live. Do you know what I mean? Like, we're now taking an expectation that has been generated by the internet to be able to just consistently, as you say, Ben, be served your favorite meal, and bringing that expectation to lived physical space.
So then the promise of the internet is heterogeneity and multiplicity, but you're saying it always, after a while, ends up being very, very reduced, streamlined, turned into specific identifiable brands.
I think that
because that's easier to consume.
I think that I think that is what tends to happen. I mean, I feel the same way that you describe, that I do feel thankful that I can just reach out and find out about something, you know, or I might just vaguely know that there's like a kind of thing, and if I sort of root around for it, I can find it, and it's just right there. I feel thankful for it. I try to relate to it in that vast library kind of way that you describe, and yet what I feel I notice is that there's just a tendency towards homogeneity. And I speculate that has to do with the fact that the internet is driven totally by volume and but by scale. It only thinks in terms of scale. Something is only a success on the internet when it happens at scale.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And transition detracts from scale. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And so I feel like everybody starts orbiting around like, well, they liked this, so now let's give them that. And then this begins to find its way into social life. And y'all say whatever you want. This could be a cool time to pivot and talk about some of the spaces that you are presenting about at your course, Ben. Like, this kind of, for some reason, gets me interested in the loft scene and whatnot, because that's something that I never experienced. But I don't want to impede. You know, if people have thoughts, like, come at me.
Well, you know, the idea of a third space,
Oh yeah, love it.
meaning not home, not work, but a third thing
Big fan.
where you find um, your community and your friends and your social circle and your people who can help you and just answers a lot of needs. Um, I wonder if places like you mentioned the Knitting Factory, sort of early version Knitting Factory, or or other clubs that had a very wide scope, are more likely to be third spaces than um, places that are more geared toward a single kind of music. That doesn't seem right to me. That doesn't seem right to me. That doesn't seem right to me. I mean, I consider the Village Vanguard almost a third space, and it's fairly reduced in terms of what goes on there.
But I think though that brings up another piece of criteria, which is that oh god, this is like such a deep rabbit hole. But like another function of this whole thing is that the constant pairing of music with lifestyle, the constant pairing of music with brands, with brand experiences, with lifestyle experiences, right? The Village Vanguard historically, you know, like it is more open. You know, it wasn't like after a kind of person. Do you know what I mean? So it could totally be a third space and be somewhat, you know, monolithic in terms of what it presents. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean the Village Vanguard is astonishing. But I
because people seek it out as opposed to it seeking people out.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another thing I would want to second and contribute here to that point is also like the kind of sense of having to search for something you don't even quite know you're searching for, you know, is something that I think is so specifically tied to like the reality of a time and a place, and especially like manifested through music. But like all kinds of these subterranean scenes are, to me, like that element of wanting something that isn't just what's given. And it doesn't always mean that like the place you're going to land has to have some kind of broad commitment to like diverse programming to be deep. It usually doesn't, actually. It's like, I think in a funny way too, I also see this kind of strange, like this strange narrowing of the scope of experience, the wider that the kind of net of available items becomes to you, because it's almost exactly like transforming them into items as opposed to like openings into new experience, no? And I guess like that kind of sense of just that to me is so specific and so deep and like so beautiful about learning about music in a specific place, as opposed to like even learning about it academically or now learning about it kind of consumeristically. It's like it opens you into the world, you know. And whether or not the Village Vanguard is like programming jazz for 60 years or is programming 100 different types of music for 60 years, it's becoming a place that you choose to go in order to learn about or gain a kind of experience you know you don't have, which is also this kind of cool paradox. It's like, to look for the thing you know you don't have, how do you know what you're looking for? What are you even looking for, right? But that's kind of part of the whole magic of it.
A really useful word that I came across recently that I've heard a million times because there's a performer that uses this word, and I actually just didn't know what it means, is a pharmacon. You know, something that is both cure and poison. And I think that is a super useful concept in a lot of ways, because you see a lot of stuff like this around these days. Because I don't want to just rain down on the internet, because I do absolutely feel how you feel, how you describe feeling, Ben. And I also think it has created a lot of access, right? It's created access for listeners, but also, like, very importantly, and this point absolutely should not be missed, it's created access to markets for performers who didn't really have the apparatuses in place to reach those markets, right? So, like, what our peers did in DC and LA, where they, like, quote unquote got in the van and they started their own record companies and pressed their own vinyl. I mean, it requires that you have a van and have enough resources to press your, and have free time and disposable income. I mean, you know what I mean? This is something that is fundamentally punk, as much as it would like to eschew this idea. It is a kind of upper middle class affair, and with important ties to middle and lower middle class people. Do you know what I mean? But it is something that exists as a function of abundance, right? And in parts of the world where these kinds of prospects are less possible, or maybe there's just not really somewhere to go in the same way that there is in America, with so many major cities with infrastructure, where you can go play. Musical artifacts from everywhere have been able to reach markets that they would not have reached. And that has been profound, and certainly has shaped my experience organizing around music in New York, because I was able to find out about things that I didn't know about, and in certain cases we're able to allocate resources to bring people here, and that's been great. And then at the same time, the thing itself erodes the context in which we all imagine this happening in, which I think is something that bears more resemblance to the Village Vanguard. Do you know what I mean? So it's this quality of, like, Pharmacon, But Ben, I wanna pivot and hear about what you're doing at NYU, and you're talking about all of these spaces, and they're all pre-internet, and many of them I don't know a lot about. And so maybe just give us
Well, I teach a lot of different classes at NYU, but I started one a couple of years ago that's continuing, which is a first year course, a first year research seminar for freshmen. And it's basically history of downtown Manhattan music. And it's it's because it's a research class, it's organized around how can we find out more about these messy, chaotic subjects about which not enough is known. And it's about, what resources do you have available to you? What archives are there in the world? How can you find good information? And how can you learn to mistrust bad information? All that stuff. And it's also about interviewing and da-da-da. But so we focus on 7 or 8 particular places or scenes in the history of downtown Manhattan music. One of which, I mean, there's a bunch of them, but like one of which is the 5 Spot, the jazz club on Cooper Square, which, 1950s, 57 to the late 60s was kind of the run of it. And it was in 2 different places, but 5 Cooper Square was the first location. And so, it was a place that when Thelonious Monk's quartet with John Coltrane played at the 5 Spot for about 6 months straight, starting in July 57, it became, it has been historicized to be such an important moment in jazz and also in American musical culture. And that place was tiny. Only 75 people maximum could fit in there. And not a whole lot was written about it at the time. And so it remains slightly murky. It remains slightly underdocumented. And so the challenge for the class is, how can we know more about it? What kind of questions can we continue to ask? And so same goes for another club we look at is the New Rican Village, which was in the mid and late 70s at 101 Avenue A, which was later the Pyramid Club. And it was a very grassroots club, very kind of like Puerto Rican pride cultural center, where they had music, but they also had plays and poetry readings and stuff. Also totally, totally tiny. I'm not even sure if they had a liquor license, but whatever. And you went in there and you were part of a community, and it was very intense. And it was run by a guy who used to be a member of the Young Lords, and there was a great sense of cultural identity going on there. And again, like really underdocumented, not well enough known. So the idea for the class is that these are all places within short walking distance from where the students are living, and I want to get into their minds that, like, on their way from their dorm room to class, they're like probably every other doorway they walk past, something significant happened in music. And if they start to think about that and connect the dots and learn what happened where, then they will start to see their own neighborhood with new eyes. And as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter if a lot of those buildings don't exist anymore. Doesn't matter if they're banks now or drugstores or whatever. They were there and something happened there. And they can think about their neighborhood like a palimpsest. And well, it's all we have, really. It's all we have. I mean, buildings get demolished and populations come and go and whatever, but it's still something happened here. And that's important to the sort of spiritual identity of any place.
How do your students respond to the idea that that's important?
Some of them are really light up right away, and I think some of them remain skeptical. But I think everybody wants to know that where they live is important. Everybody, wants to know that where they're spending time has some kind of importance in the world. And if they can lock into an importance that not everybody else knows about, and it's like this is not a formally landmarked spot, and there's no gift shops here, that actually makes it even cooler.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. Do you feel that this is important in part because we're living through a time where there's a kind of diminishing interest in like historicity? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yes, I do. Yes, there is a diminishing interest in historicity. I think history gets elided or paved over, purely for reasons of, commerce, basically, finishing the transaction more efficiently, getting in and out more quickly so that you can move to the next thing. I don't know, man. It's like the too long didn't read phenomenon.
The what? Oh, too long to read.
Yeah.
Too long didn't read.
Yeah. There seems to be so much else to do and look at.
Right.
So you may tell yourself that you don't have enough time to explore the proper context of something and understand the history of something.
Right.
Basically, teachers like me, well, almost every teacher I know is telling students these days, essentially, slow down. Slow down, think a little more, and then think a little more. Look harder, and then look again, and then look again. I mean, we're all saying the same thing.
Right. Yeah. Huh. Now, why would that be exactly, that there's a diminishing interest in historicity? I mean, I have ideas, but maybe I don't know.
Wow. We could go all sorts of ways with this, but it sounds like you
That's
have
a big question.
it sounds like you have a
No.
particular answer.
I want to get outside of my own
Well,
mental
I
loop.
look, to me, it basically comes down to the profit motive, which ensures that, you're gonna skip the details and go straight for the sale.
Can you explain what do you put that in context? Like, what do you mean?
It means, yes. There are many, many forces in the world that are trying to sell to us all the time. That want our business, that want our attention, that are competing for us to be the product. The thing from the popular documentary, the social dilemma, the mantra, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
So like, lots and lots of younger people are the product in a million different ways. Perhaps they're not seeing it, whatever. And because they are the product, they're being hustled very quickly through an experience of the world of culture. And so, of course, that elides history. And of course, that elides context.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It kind of forecloses on a.
I think it's also to me, it's a question of a kind of transmutation of value of what is, for instance, even in bringing up like the great example of a place like the Five Spot, which Ben points out has a 75-person capacity, and yet this place is mythic now. No, this place is legendary. This place has such an outsized imprint in the cultural memory, despite how small it was. And we think now about what are the things that are going to register, that are going to imprint in a so-called cultural memory. They are things of hyper scale, not necessarily of great depth or magnitude. They are things that are the most ticked. 500 million views on YouTube, 1.2 billion views on YouTube. Well, that's multiplication. There's no depth to that. There's no mythos. And there's something to me that's the great beauty of historical thinking and historical investigation at all, or a kind of passion or sense for that, is so tied to place, because place is also so much about the myth making. It's also like, Ben, you were saying, people want to feel that where they are is important. Well, that's also a kind of myth making, no? So it's like you tie yourself to the past through a mythologizing, and I think that there's a beautiful value in that. I don't think that that's inherently wrong. I think that there's also a moment now where we are devaluing that to such an extent that it's also this kind of sense of the saleable. It's the thing that leaves the imprint now is the thing with 1,000 arms, as opposed to like one strong hand, right? It's crazy.
Yeah. And I think that one of the reasons that the Five Spot remains important is because so many people, well, I don't know about whether it was so many people or that they were like the right people, in a city full of artists and media and whatever, who used it as a third space. Like, people hung out at the Five Spot every night. That became a big part of their lives. And they drank there a lot and fell in love and, fucked up and had long, meaningless conversations and like wasted a lot of time in a way, or did something that could look like wasting a lot of time, but it was a normal part of their life. And at that point in history, going out to a bar every night, in fact, the same bar every night, didn't mark them as being a loser.
Right. Well, because this gets into like a whole other territory that we don't really need to get into, but it does have to do with space or like a experience of being somewhere.
Oh yeah.
People used to, okay, I don't want to say I don't want to totalize, but here we go. It used to be more common that the goal was to be in New York. Like, you got to New York, you had arrived. That was the goal, right? People, I think, often view New York as a springboard to some other thing, right? Like, I think there's it's very common in the musical game to come to New York, align yourself with a community or a crew or a label, get an agent, go play festivals in Europe. You're pulling down some bread, move upstate. Do you know what I mean? It's like get in, get it done, and dip. No shade, Patrick. Patrick's a lifelong New Yorker. He can live anywhere he wants in the state. No, if you move to Vermont, I'm coming for you. No, I'm just kidding. But do you understand? It's a more utilitarian attitude about the city and like certain potentials that it has to propel you to other things. And just the gaze is generally less New York centric, right? I remember distinctly in the 90s just being in New York all the time and doing exactly what you're saying, going to the knitting factory all the time. It never occurred to me that was like not cool or something. You know what I mean? I was like, this is the dream. I'm here. I'm going to this place. I've been like kind of paying attention to from afar for years. Mission accomplished. Do you know what I mean? It was the same in the DC scene as well, where the goal was just to be on the scene. I mean, there was nothing else to have. You know what I mean? And even once you were on the scene, even if you were playing great shows, there wasn't that much money. I mean, it was, you know what I mean? It was like a pretty meager amount of money. The only thing to get out of it was camaraderie. You know what I mean? And so
but I think that to me, what you're saying there, Sam, like articulates a really deep aspect of physical space. So I like, just to interrupt briefly,
no, do
because
it, man.
I think that actually gets at something really profound. It's like that precise thing is a quality probably only of physical space. I think like the kind of virtual space is ultimately like projective at best and hyper consumerist or oppressive at worst. It doesn't have precisely that feature. And it's like that seems to me really fundamental to something that might even go so far as to like characterize or constitute space. I mean, in other words, like the place is the destination. It's not a entrepot or like a place into somewhere else that doesn't really exist, which is like the totally projective character of the internet now. It's like every space is available to you at all times, meaning all places are spaceless. It's this totally bizarre phenomenology of no space in every space all the time in your pocket. There's no destination ever.
Yeah,
there's no destination.
And the ability to effectively leave any place that you are by absenting yourself into one of those spaces. So I'm gonna share with you one of my most dubious theories. I'm a connoisseur of dubiousness. That's one of my great strengths. And then just for a preview, Ben, you mentioned to me that one of the things that you talk about in this course is like a Chinese opera scene that orbited around Bowery in like the 19th century. So then I'm going to ask you about that, but let's riff on this other thing for a second. Because I think about this all the time, because it's like we all need to be embroiled in this thing to do what we do. And yet we have this feeling that this thing is somehow eroding either the character or the fabric of what we do or the place that it happens or whatever, right? And so what is the antidote, you know? And I think this is ridiculous. I mean, but there's something there. There's something there, though. There's something there. Check it out. I think that like the thing that no one wants to do, that nobody wants to be a part of, is something that's like corny or whack or like off. You know, like just not hitting. You know what I mean? Like something that just isn't. It's like this thing that you were talking about, Ben, of something being like dialed in. Something that's just not. It just isn't working. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's like, that sounds crazy because it sounds like I'm proposing something that just doesn't work. And I think like there are examples when you think back. I mean, I think we probably all forget or just don't know how much a few examples. Like when you look at like the first Melvins record, there's a picture of these there's a picture of the Melvins and they're like in the lawn and they just look kind of like deadbeats. And it's like, I kind of feel like well, that's because they were. It like actually wasn't cool. Like not, and I don't mean cool as in like cool kid at school. I mean like it was like a bad situation. Do you know what I'm saying? Like they were doing this thing, nobody liked it, nobody understood it, and they just were on this weird trip, and people thought they were losers, and it was dark. Do you know what I'm saying? And that is something that just is the most anathema. Like no one wants to weather a second of that. You follow what I mean? And it's like if you just give up on that deep, dark place where things aren't working, you kind of foreclose on like heights, right? Like the idea of being lotus born, like the Buddhist idea, right? It's like it comes from the mud. That's the idea, right? Another thing that may have been like that, I don't know, but it's like imagine like something I think about all the time just as inspiration is like Anthony Braxton and Muhal Richard Abrams and Roscoe Mitchell just in the projects in Chicago in the 50s playing chess and listening to Stockhausen. It's like, what was that as a hang? Do you know what I'm saying? It's like that couldn't have been like a thing people were doing. Do you know what I mean? It was just they were just out on a limb. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I'm kind of trying to you know what I'm kind of arguing for is like abjection. Like the experience of abjection, and you know, and this was kind of celebrated like in the 90s, like the Beck song, like "Loser," right? It's like that's kind of a sort of a little bit watered down kind of echo of that idea. Do you know what I mean? That like it's actually not cool. I'm a loser.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that as a club proprietor? You want to go to a place where people want to go. Or one wants to go to a place where other people want to go.
Yeah, I know, it's a dilemma. But there's something to it. I mean, a way that you can, I think that there's a way, I mean, this is like, okay, this is a thing about like, I think that there's a thing about being cool, right? Like where people think of being cool these days, right? As doing things that are cool. Do you follow what I mean? But I think that like there's another idea about that where it's like it becomes cool because you're doing it, right? That's a much more like empowered, like embodied attitude about it.
Yeah, that's a lovely idea.
You know, like I can step into the room and just make this a vibe. No, I'm not saying that about myself. That's absolutely not what I mean. But what I mean is that like try. I think as an answer to your question, trying to affect a situation where gradually you promote evaluation of experiences of the aspect of experiences that are other. And that maybe people even feel judgmental about, but there's an aspect of it that you can just sit back and be like, man, this is wild. Like, what? Do you know what I mean? You can seek kind of gently and gradually to promote evaluation of the fact that you just might go to this place and just who knows what's going to be going on. Do you know what I mean? And you can kind of laugh about it or stuff. Even laughing at something is like kind of positive and like related. Relative to the nihilism of just burrowing into stuff that you already know about and care about. That's like darker for everybody than actually like laughing at something almost in like a ridiculing kind of way. But I mean, it becomes too dark when you're actually harassing somebody and making fun of them aggressively or something. But if you're just in a space and someone's up to something that you just find so unrelatable that it's just funny to you, do you know what I mean? And somebody could totally feel that way about free jazz, right? And maybe the people who are super into free jazz would be like, can you believe this person, you know? But there's something deep about it. Do you know what I mean? You see something and and someone encounters free jazz and they're like, dude, what? what? And they're just cracking up. That's kind of cool. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
and maybe there's a way to build an enclosure around that, and then that comes to be something that people look forward to.
Pat, don't you think that there's always a new thing around the corner that embodies what Sam is talking about? That there's
Yeah.
always a new bunch of musicians around the corner who are building some new fucked up thing that, only they and their friends know is cool. But the level of intent with which they're doing it, and the kind of authenticity of all their of the way they're doing it and the way they live and everything just makes it all great. I mean, like, there's
Yeah.
always something new like that.
There is. I do tend to feel that. I think that's got to be true, right? I mean, that's probably been true forever in a wonderful way. And I guess like the interesting moment now is that I think what's maybe the first new thing in a long time is that we're in an age now where like every little moment is broadcasted. So I wonder, like, in response to that, because yeah, Ben, I do agree with you, but I also wonder, like, well, what is now the effect of sort of no longer having solitude, even shared solitude? What's the effect of no longer having the kind of private, fucking weird niche, the little nook? Not to fetishize it, but in a deeper sense, like there's almost, I see also a kind of an important link between like the even just ability to not always be observed or broadcasting, and the ability to like really get into your own kind of freaky new vibe. And now, of course, that'll continue, and maybe it's just like my blind spot now, but I do wonder how that's gonna like how that is going to affect things, or whether it already has. I mean, that seems really significant. This kind of broadcast culture,
Hmm.
you know, everything
Mhm.
shared all the time, right? I mean, it's like an interesting question with respect to like the outsider, in other words, like the sort of niche, innovative groups that are almost about never being seen until there's this moment of accidental breakthrough or discovery or not, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know. I mean, I pose that more as a question to everyone, I guess.
There's this thing. I mean, I really want to hear about Chinese opera, but there's this thing where it's like, oh man, like the loser, the sort of scepter of the loser today, right? Like the social the way in which that archetype lives in our present is this like incel 4chan video game, Call of Duty parent basement guy, right? Like that's the kind of, and that's like too dark. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's not this like social like way to be. I don't know. I'm a little. My vision sort of expires into this idea, but essentially, to sum it up, it's worthwhile. Abjection is worthwhile, but there's this slippery slope in cultural space where you go from like vying to be cool and with it and dialed in to like this like to depravity, and there's not really like a middle ground. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's like,
I thought you were going to say that there's a slippery slope from being abject to becoming commodified. That the new
Yeah.
the new noise scene
well, that's also true.
all of a sudden becomes something sponsored by Supreme.
Well, of course. I mean, absolutely. That's what happens
Right.
every time, right? And that's like a whole other sidebar,
Yeah.
which is that like I would put that in like another category, which is like the inability for anything to gestate, right? Like the best example of this is that MC McConan, right? Like McConan was a basically anonymous indie rapper, had that breakout hit Club Turning Up on a Tuesday. And then Drake jumped in the mix. Now you can't even find that video on YouTube because everything you find is just Drake related. And McConan carries on and lives their life. But that experience of like touring in a van and gradually building it up and getting slightly bigger and putting one brick on the next is deprived to people, because the moment something has a promise like that, like you said, Supreme and Adidas and Red Bull and so on swoop in and turn it into this kind of bottle rocket effect where, yes, it gets really high and then it fizzles out, and sort of what happens after that is kind of hard to determine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, I'm a 52-year-old man, Sam. So my understanding of things is very limited. But I think that the future belongs to, in culture, the future belongs to the undersharers, the Frank Oceans of the world, or people who bizarrely show bizarre and brave amounts of refusal at key moments.
Right.
And just don't necessarily go stay on the conveyor belt. I put a lot of trust in that, and I'm sure that will continue. No matter how much incentive people are given to always be broadcasting, I'm sure that there will always be people who understand the value of keeping something for themselves, hanging back, remaining mysterious, maintaining a cabal type attitude.
Facts. That's amazing. That's a great thought, man. That's cool. That's uplifting.
Yeah, no, well said. I quite agree with that. Absolutely.
Will you tell us about the Chinese opera scene downtown in the 19th century?
Yeah, really briefly. I mean, in the late 20s to the early 30s, maybe like a 5-year window, there were a number of Chinese opera companies that operated out of a number of theaters on Bowery, just south of Houston. And at their peak, they were full every night, mostly full of Chinese people, but increasingly full of non-Chinese people who heard about this and wanted to experience it as a New York thing that to them would be strange and interesting and exotic. It was covered once in a while in the press, like in the New York Times, with buckets of racism. I mean, the most unbelievably racist caricatures of sort of like posing as a cultural report. And it was popular Cantonese opera music of the time. This was right during the period when the record industry was exploding, the late 20s, and all of a sudden more and more people had record players at home, and there was a thriving record industry for Chinese opera music. And it's something that happened. And not that many people in New York know about it, and it's not particularly well documented, but there's a couple of historians who have found out almost everything there is to find out. And it's another thing to explore about what happened, just steps away from NYU or where these students are going.
Does it survive in any way? I mean, clearly the legacy of Chinese opera survives, but meaning, like, is there any type of connection between a present institution and that practice?
No, not that I know of. No, not that I know of, no.
Interesting, but that's amazing to imagine. I love hearing stories like that about New York.
Yeah.
Well, fellas, this has been amazing.
Yeah, it was great to be with you guys.
Yeah, you guys are deep.
Yes.
Likewise. You're too kind. I'm gonna do my little outro, but to all of you out there in Twitch land, Ben Ratliff, Patrick Higgins, and thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us. That was my pleasure and lovely to speak with you both.
For sure,
Best
Sam.
wishes.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I'm sure we'll all be in touch shortly.
Good. I can't wait.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Later. Okay.
Ciao, guys.
There you have it. Public Assembly, first official episode. I'm Sam Hilmer, creative director here at Hollow. Place of Assembly, Public Assembly. I'm botching this. Here we go. Place of Assembly is a program produced by Hollow, and please support us on Patreon, patreon.com/Hollow. We are kind of in a transitional period as we all continue to weather this experience we're having. We're doing some new programs like this podcast, and we have some audio series out and a line of shirts going. And it would be great to count on your support. So we're here every Monday at 7 p.m. EST. The program is also presented in partnership with Experimental Sound Studio Chicago and 8 Ball Radio, and airs every Monday at 9:30 on 8 Ball Radio. And we'll be back next week with D.B. Berkman, legendary drum and bass fellow, and also space operator and many other things. Thank you, guys. That's it.